What if an entire city vanished so quickly that even the shadows it left behind seemed confused, before anyone understood what was happening on Gunkanjima? Before the world realized this lonely concrete island was more than a mining colony lost at sea, something far darker had already taken root. From a distance, the island looks like a massive battleship frozen in place, an armored fortress rising from violent waters. But as you come closer, the illusion breaks, and what remains is a ghost town so perfectly preserved. It feels staged, almost deliberate, as if the island wants to be remembered on its own terms. That unsettling precision is the first warning that Gunkanjima is not just abandoned. It is haunted by truths no one has fully faced. For decades, the island pulsed with life. Thousands of people lived stacked in suffocating blocks of concrete, trapped between the crushing weight of the mines below and the unpredictable waves above. Yet the silence that blankets the ruins today is even heavier. Windows stare outward like empty sockets. Long corridors hold no footsteps, but they echo with something else. A feeling that time here did not simply stop, it fractured. And when you walk through the remnants of its apartments, with half-made beds, toys scattered on floors, and personal belongings untouched for half a century, you begin to sense that whatever forced the departure was abrupt, unplanned, and terrifying enough that no one dared return to claim what they left behind. But why? Why does Gunkanjima feel less like a former city and more like a crime scene sealed by the sea? Even historians struggle to explain the island's contradictions. How could a place celebrated as a technological triumph, a model of Japan's industrial rise, become one of the most chilling symbols of abandonment the world has ever seen? And why does every record describing its official end feel strangely incomplete, as if the real story was deliberately cut out or buried beneath layers of polite silence? The deeper you look, the more unsettling the patterns become. Entire hallways collapse in ways that suggest structural failure long before the evacuation. Doors appear forced open, not by rescuers, but by residents desperate to escape unseen dangers. And beneath it all lies the mine, a labyrinth descending into darkness, where countless workers once labored under conditions so harsh that many never received. Official reports call their stories unveiled. Survivors call them the truth no one wanted to document. So the mystery begins long before the island was emptied. It begins with whispers of exploitation, accidents hidden from public view, and tensions rising among workers who felt the island itself was turning against them. As these fragments come together, they reveal a city whose foundations were built on pressure, political pressure, economic pressure, and a relentless demand for coal that pushed the island past its breaking point. Gunkanjima was never designed for peace. It was designed to consume lives as quickly as it consumed coal, and when both ran out, collapse was inevitable. Yet the strangest part is what happened afterward. Nothing. No official investigation into the rapid evacuation. No effort to recover documents or secure hazardous zones. No attempt to repurpose the island. It was simply locked away, as if Japan itself wanted to close a chapter it feared reopening. The island remained untouched for decades, sealed in an unnatural pause that preserved it like a frozen photograph. A photograph no one dared interpret. And this is where the real story begins to twist. Because every mystery on Gunkanjima leads to another. Every shadow hints at something concealed. And every unanswered question points toward a truth powerful enough to transform a thriving city into a forbidden relic almost overnight. Before we move deeper into the island's dark history, one question lingers. Was Gunkanjima abandoned or silenced? If you're intrigued by this mystery so far, leave a comment sharing what struck you the most about this frozen ghost town. Want to support more stories like this? Drop a like, subscribe, and stay with me as we unravel what truly happened beneath Gunkanjima's concrete shell. What turned a lifeless rock in the middle of the sea into one of the most extreme urban experiments ever attempted was not ambition alone, but desperation. Beneath Gunkanjima es concrete skinley a resource. Japan could not afford to ignore coal. In the late 19th century, as the country rushed to modernize, fuel was power, and power meant survival. Mitsubishi saw opportunity where others saw danger. The island was barely habitable, constantly battered by typhoons, surrounded by violent currents, and offering no natural protection. Yet below its surface stretched rich coal seams, buried deep under the seabed. Extracting them would require pushing human limits in ways few societies openly admitted. The solution was radical. Instead of building a temporary mining camp, Mitsubishi transformed the island into a vertical city, stacking lives as tightly as possible above the shafts. Concrete apartment blocks rose one after another, designed not for comfort, but efficiency. Every meter mattered. Space was rationed. Privacy vanished. Families lived wall to wall, floor to ceiling, surrounded by the constant vibration of machinery and the distant echo of explosions underground. Achi, its peak. Gunkanjima became the most densely populated place on Earth, surpassing even the crowded districts of Tokyo. From the outside, the island projected strength and progress. It was showcased as proof of Japan's industrial genius, a self-contained world with schools, hospitals, cinemas, shops, and even rooftop playgrounds. Photographs from the era show smiling children, neat uniforms, and orderly streets. But those images were carefully curated. They hid a harsher reality beneath the surface. One shaped by relentless schedules, exhaustion, and an unspoken understanding that the island existed for one purpose only: extraction. The mines themselves were a different world. Narrow tunnels plunged hundreds of meters below sea level, where heat climbed to unbearable levels, and humidity turned the air thick and heavy. Workers labored for long hours in near darkness, surrounded by the constant risk of flooding, gas buildup, and collapse. Accidents were not rare. They were expected. When something went wrong, it often stayed underground, quietly absorbed into production targets and company reports that favored output over accountability. As coal fueled Japan's rise, Gunkanjima's population swelled. More buildings were added, often hastily, sometimes without proper reinforcement. Maintenance lagged behind expansion. Cracks appeared. Corridors sagged. Residents noticed, but complaints rarely traveled far. The island's isolation worked against them. There was nowhere else to go, and leaving meant losing employment, housing, and stability. In a country or leave in mente, for many families, staying felt safer than starting over on the mainland. The deeper truth is that Gunkanjima was never meant to last. It was built as a machine, not a community. Every system on the island revolved around production schedules dictated by distant offices. When coal demand surged, people were packed in. When profits dipped, repairs were delayed. The island Architecture reflected this mindset. Massive concrete walls faced the sea to protect corporate investment, while interior spaces were left cramped and fragile. Strength outward, weakness inward. By the mid-20th century, cracks began appearing not just in buildings, but in the logic of the island itself. New energy sources emerged. Oil replaced coal. What had once been priceless slowly became expendable. Yet Gunkanjima kept running, driven by inertia and the fear of admitting that the entire enterprise had reached its limits. Workers sensed the shift before any official announcement. Shifts grew tense. Maintenance crews were stretched thinner. Rumors circulated of mines becoming unstable, of sections quietly sealed off and never mentioned again. And still, life continued above ground. Children played on rooftops without seeing the danger beneath their feet. Families cooked dinners while the sea pounded the walls outside. The city functioned, but barely, like a structure held together by habit rather than safety. This contradiction is what makes Gunkanjima so disturbing. It was a place where modernity and neglect coexisted, where progress masked decay, and where an entire population lived atop a ticking clock they were never allowed to see. The empire that rose from the sea was powerful, but it was also brittle. And as economic priorities shifted, the island's value collapsed faster than anyone expected. What followed would not be a slow decline, but something far more abrupt, setting the stage for a disappearance that still unsettles historians and survivors alike. Living on Gunkanjima was not simply about residing on an island. It was about existing inside a structure that never truly slept. A vertical maze of concrete where every sound carried, every movement echoed, and privacy was more concept than reality. The buildings rose tightly packed, their windows staring directly into other windows, their walls thin enough to transmit arguments, laughter, coughing, and crying from one apartment to the next. Residents often describe the sensation as being inside a massive hive, thousands of lives stacked together, all vibrating to the same mechanical rhythm. Apartments were small, utilitarian, and designed to serve function rather than comfort. Families adapted by compressing their lives into narrow spaces. Children slept in shared rooms. Furniture was minimal. Personal belongings were carefully rationed because there was nowhere to put them. Ventilation was poor, and during the humid summers, heat lingered inside the concrete long after the sun set. In winter, the sea winds cut through cracks in the buildings, turning hallways into cold tunnels that never fully warmed. Despite this, daily life followed a strict routine. The island woke early. Sirens signaled shifts below ground. Elevators groaned under constant use. Men descended into the mines before dawn, while women managed households, worked in support roles, or took kariav. Children in an environment where outdoor space barely existed. Rooftops became playgrounds, social spaces, and escape valves. Up there, residents could briefly forget the weight beneath their feet and the sea pressing against the walls. But even these moments carried unease. Parents watched children carefully, aware that the barriers separating rooftops from open air were never designed with safety as the first priority. Rust crept into railings. Concrete chipped and flaked. Maintenance crews patched visible damage, but deeper structural issues went untouched. People learned to live around danger, not because they trusted the island, but because acknowledging its fragility meant confronting the possibility that everything could collapse. Inside the buildings, the atmosphere was thick with noise and tension. Machinery below ground created a constant low-frequency vibration that never fully faded. At night, the sound became more noticeable as if the island itself were breathing. Some residents later recalled struggling to sleep, plagued by the sensation that the walls were subtly shifting. Others described dreams of flooding, of corridors filling with water, of doors that would not open. And then there were the tunnels, access points to their minds, were visible reminders of what powered the island. Workers disappeared into them each day, returning exhausted, covered in coal dust, their faces marked by fatigue. Children grew up watching fathers and older brothers age rapidly, their bodies bearing the cost of labor a few outsiders ever saw. Injuries were common. Chronic illness was expected. Talking about fear was not. Silence became a survival skill. Complaints were rarely voiced openly. The company controlled housing, employment, and access to the mainland. Speaking out risked everything. So residents adapted. They normalized the abnormal. Cracks in stairwells were ignored. Strange smells were dismissed. Sudden closures of corridors or buildings were accepted without explanation. The island taught its people to stop asking questions. Yet unease spread quietly. Some residents noticed doors being sealed permanently. Certain floors were no longer accessible. Areas once bustling grew strangely empty. Official explanations were vague, framed as renovations or safety measures, but details never followed. People whispered at night, careful to keep voices low. They sensed that something beneath the surface was changing, and that whatever it was not being shared with them. What made life on Gunkanjima especially disturbing was not just the physical confinement, but the psychological one. The island created dependency. Leaving meant abandoning a tightly controlled world for uncertainty on the mainland. Many families had nowhere else to go. Children were raised believing the island was normal, that this dense, sealed environment was simply how life worked. Only later would some realize how extreme it truly was. By the time the signs of deeper trouble became impossible to ignore, the island's population had already learned to endure in silence. The concrete hive continued to function, outwardly stable, inwardly strained, and as pressure mounted from below and decay spread above, the sense that something irreversible was approaching grew stronger, even if no one dared name it aloud. Beneath the image of progress that Gunkanjima projected to the outside world existed a reality that was never meant to be seen. The island's success was measured in output, not in human costs, and the deeper Japan pushed toward industrial dominance, the less visible that cost became. Official photographs showed clean uniforms, orderly classrooms, and smiling families. What they did not show were the bodies that broke underground, the exhaustion that hollowed out faces, or the silent calculations that decided how much risk was acceptable in the pursuit of coal. During the most intense years of production, labor shortages became a serious problem. The work was brutal, the conditions unforgiving, and few volunteers from the mainland were willing to endure them for long. As Japan expanded its empire across Asia, the solution arrived in a form rarely acknowledged in corporate histories: forced labor. Korean and Chinese workers were transported to sites like Gunkanjima under coercive conditions, promised wages, or freedom that often never materialized. Once on the island, they were trapped by geography, language barriers, and a system designed to extract labor with minimal oversight. These workers lived apart from Japanese families, housed in more cramped, poorly maintained quarters, often closer to the most dangerous sections of the mine. Their shifts were longer. Their safety equipment was inferior. Complaints were ignored or punished. Injuries went undocumented. Deaths were recorded vaguely, if at all. The official narrative later reduced their suffering to footnotes or denied it entirely, creating a gap between lived, experienced, and recorded history that still fuels controversy today. Even among Japanese workers, transparency was limited. Accidents happened frequently. Caverns, gas leaks, flooding incidents deep below sea level were an ever-present threat. When something went wrong, information moved upward slowly, filtered through layers of management more concerned with continuity than accountability. Families were told as little as possible. Sometimes a worker simply did not return, explained away as reassignment or illness. Over time, these disappearances accumulated into something harder to ignore. One of the most disturbing aspects of Gunkanjima's hidden history is how thoroughly silence was enforced. Surveillance was informal but effective. Supervisors monitored behavior. Rumors of punishment circulated freely, whether exaggerated or not. Workers learned quickly that asking too many questions marked you as a problem. On an island where housing, food, access, and transportation were controlled by the same authority that employed you, resistance was a luxury few could afford. As war intensified in the Pacific, conditions worsened. Resources were redirected. Safety standards slipped further. Maintenance was deferred. The mines were pushed harder. Even as structural integrity declined, workers sensed the shift immediately. Tanas felt less stable. Equipment failures increased. The margin for error vanished, yet production quotas did not adjust to reality. They were dictated by necessity, not feasibility. After the war, Japan's rapid reconstruction relied heavily on narratives of resilience and unity. Sites like Gunkanjima were reframed as symbols of national effort and sacrifice. The darker elements were deliberately soft or erased. Mitsubishi's role was celebrated for technological achievement, while the labor that made it possible was abstracted into statistics. Survivors who attempted to speak publicly often encountered resistance, disbelief, or legal pressure. Their testimonies conflicted with a version of history that had already been carefully polished. This erasure had long-term consequences. When the island was later proposed for recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, international criticism reached. Former forced laborers demanded acknowledgement. Governments debated responsibility. Statements were issued, parsed, revised. Apologies were vague. Promises of remembrance remained ambiguous. The island itself, silent and decaying, stood as the only witness that could not be edited. What makes this chapter especially unsettling is not just the exploitation, but how efficiently it was buried. Gunkanjima was not an anomaly. It was part of a broader system where rapid modernization justified extreme measures and where economic success became a shield against moral scrutiny. The island's concrete walls did not just contain people. They contained truths that were never meant to leave. And as these truths remained unresolved, pressure continued to build, both structurally and socially. The wealth generated by Gunkanjima came at a cost that could not be sustained indefinitely. The question was no longer whether the island would fail, but when and what form that failure would take. Long before the evacuation, the island started to signal distress in ways that were easy to dismiss and dangerous to ignore. Gunkanjima had always lived at the mercy of the sea, but in its later years, the balance shifted. Typhoons grew more violent. Waves struck the sea walls with unfamiliar force. Salt water crept into places it had never reached before, corroding metal, weakening concrete, and accelerating decay in structures already stretched beyond their limits. What had once been an engineering triumph began to feel like a losing battle against physics. Inside the buildings, residents noticed subtle changes. Hairline cracks widened along stairwells and ceilings. Doors jammed without explanation. Elevators stalled more frequently, sometimes trapping passengers between floors as the structure flexed under stress. On lower levels, dampness lingered even in dry weather. A faint smell of seawater appeared in corridors far from the shore-facing walls, suggesting seepage that maintenance crews struggled to contain. Below ground, the situation was more alarming. Mining under the seabed had always carried the risk of flooding, but as years passed and maintenance budgets tightened, that risk increased. Bumpy's home, constantly to keep water at bay. Any failure could be catastrophic. Workers reported tunnels that felt unstable where walls wept moisture and the ground vibrated under pressure from above. Sections of the mine were quietly closed off, sealed without explanation, as if erasing a problem could make it disappear. Management insisted everything was under control. Official notices spoke of routine repairs and precautionary measures. But actions told a different story. Certain buildings were evacuated internally. Residents moved to other blocks without clear reasoning. Access routes changed. Safety drills became more frequent and less transparent. People began to sense that the island's margins for error were narrowing rapidly. Then there were the storms. Typhoons battered Gunkanjima relentlessly, sometimes cutting it off from the mainland for days. During these periods, fear spread. Waves overtopped seawalls. Debris crashed against buildings. Power flickered. Emergency generators struggled. In some storms, seawater reportedly reached ground-level apartments, forcing families to barricade doors and wait, listening as the ocean tested the island's defenses inch by inch. Each storm left scars. Repairs were made quickly, often superficially, just enough to keep operations running. But the cumulative damage was undeniable. Engineers knew it. Workers felt it. Residents lived it. The island was aging rapidly, and unlike cities on land, there was no room to retreat, no safe perimeter to expand into. Gunkanjima had nowhere to go but inward, compressing risk and stress into an already fragile system. At the same time, the economic rationale that once justified these risks was collapsing. Coal demand declined sharply as oil and alternative energy sources took over. What had been worth any cost was now barely profitable. Yet shutting down operations was not simple. Thousands of lives depended on the island's continued function. Housing, employment, identity, all were tied to a place increasingly at odds with reality. This tension created a dangerous inertia. Operations continued not because they were safe, but because stopping felt impossible. Each day added strain to structures never designed for prolonged use at such intensity. Every delay increased the likelihood that a single failure, one pump, one wall, one storm could trigger a chain reaction no one could contain. Residents sensed this long before it was acknowledged. Conversations grew cautious. Families prepared quietly. Some packed essentials without admitting why. Others dismissed their fears, clinging to routine as protection against uncertainty. The island existed in a state of suspended collapse, functioning just well enough to survive, but not well enough to inspire confidence. And as the sea continued its slow, patient advance, Gunkanjima approached a tipping point. The question was no longer whether the island could be saved, but whether those in charge would admit the truth before it was too late. There was no long farewell, no gradual thinning of the population, no slow transition into abandonment. When the end came to Gunkanjima, it arrived with a speed that stunned those who lived there. One day the island functioned as it always had, loud, crowded, vibrating with routine. Soon after, it was ordered to empty itself. The announcement was brief, clinical, and final. Coal production would cease. The island would be if families were told to prepare to leave, not in months or weeks, but in days. For residents, the message felt unreal. Gunkanjima had always been permanent in their minds. Gunkanjima was supposed to last. Seawalls were supposed to protect. The company had always insisted the island was safe, controlled, engineered to endure. And yet now, without warning, that certainty dissolved. Questions flooded in, but answers were scarce. Why so suddenly? Why now? What had changed beneath the surface that made delay impossible? What followed was not chaos, but something quieter and more disturbing. People packed in silence. Essential belongings were gathered. Furniture was left behind. Personal items that had once felt valuable suddenly felt heavy and impractical. Apartments were emptied hastily, as if residents believed they might return soon. Some even left meals half-prepared. Calendars still marked with future dates, doors locked carefully behind them. The speed of departure suggests not just urgency, but fear. Boats arrive, continuously shuttling families to the mainland. Each trip removed another layer of life from the island. Children clutched bags. Adults avoided eye contact. Many later described the sensation of disbelief, as if watching their own lives collapse from a distance. The sounds that once defined Gunkanjima sirens, machinery voices fell away one by one. Elevators stopped. Lights went dark. Pumps were shut down. The island exhaled for the first time in decades. Official records described the evacuation as orderly and efficient. And it was that efficiency, however, raises uncomfortable questions. An operation of this scale requires planning. It requires foresight. It requires knowledge that the situation was no longer manageable well before the public announcement. They suggest the danger was not sudden, but anticipated, monitored, and ultimately deemed too great to explain in full. Within weeks, Gunkanjima was empty, not abandoned slowly, but frozen mid-motion. Laundry still hung in some apartments. School materials remained stacked on desks. Shoes sat by doorways. The island did not decay into silence over time. It snapped into it, and that abruptness is what continues to disturb visitors today. The city feels paused, not finished. No comprehensive investigation followed. No public inquiry detailed the risks that led to the shutdown. Mines were sealed. Access was restricted. The island was cut off and left to weather alone. Whatever final assessments were made, they remained internal, locked away with corporate archives and engineering reports, never released to the public. For former residents, the night everything stopped marked a rupture that never fully healed. Many refused to speak about it. Others described recurring dreams of unfinished rooms and unanswered questions. The island had shaped their lives, then discarded them without explanation. And for the outside world, Gunkanjima became a curiosity, a relic stripped of context and emotion. But silence does not erase uncertainty. The speed of the evacuation, the lack of transparency, and the decision to leave the island untouched suggests that the real reason for abandonment may have been more serious than economic decline alone. Something had crossed the line. Something had made delay unacceptable. Once the last boat departed and Gunkanjima fell silent, the island was not simply abandoned, it was sealed. Access was restricted. Patrols were irregular but deliberate, and the message was clear. This place was no longer meant to be entered. Officially, the reasons were safety and liability, unstable buildings, collapsing corridors, flooded mine shafts. But for years, that explanation felt incomplete, especially as rumors began to circulate about what remained inside. Despite the restrictions, people returned, not residents, but explorers, journalists, photographers, urban adventurers, drawn by the unsettling stillness of a city left mid. What they've found challenged the idea of a clean, controlled shutdown. Entire sections of the island were inaccessible, sealed behind welded doors or collapsed passageways that looked less like natural decay and more like intentional barriers. Some stairwells ended abruptly. Some rooms showed signs of forced entry, not by looters, but by people trying to escape or reach something before leaving. In certain buildings, documents were missing entirely. Offices that should have contained records were empty. Filing cabinets were overturned or removed. The absence was noticeable because other personal items remained untouched. Clothing, photographs, toys, even cash sat undisturbed. Yet paperwork related to operations, safety assessments, or personnel was nowhere to be found. This selective disappearance fueled speculation that sensitive information had been removed deliberately before abandonment. Explorers also reported inconsistencies in the island's condition. Some areas deteriorated as expected, weathered by salt and storms. Others appeared strangely preserved, as if maintained briefly after evacuation, then left to rot all at once. Electrical panels were stripped. Mechanical rooms were cleared. Mine entrances were sealed with unusual care, reinforced beyond what abandonment alone would require. These were not the actions of a company walking away casually. They suggested containment. The most unsettling discoveries came from the lower levels. Flooded shafts concealed unknown depths. Warning signs remained in place, faded but legible, indicating hazards that had never been publicly disclosed. In some tunnels, equipment lay abandoned mid-task, suggesting work stopped abruptly. Rather than winding down, the deeper one went. The clear-red became that parts of Gunkanjima were never meant to be seen again. Former employees who later spoke privately described strict instructions during the evacuation: do not return, do not photograph certain areas, do not discuss conditions underground. These directives were informal but effective. Fear of legal consequences, combined with a cultural emphasis on silence and conformity, kept most people quiet. Over time, memory faded. Stories blurred. The island's final days slipped into myth. When Gunkanjima was eventually reopened to the public decades later, access was tightly controlled. Tour routes were narrow. Certain buildings remained off. Guides focused on architecture and daily life, avoiding deeper questions about labor, accidents, or the sudden evacuation. What visitors saw was real, but incomplete. The island presented a curated version of itself, one that felt intentionally restrained. This controlled narrative only deepened suspicion. If this Lungi story was simple, why limit it so carefully? Why not open archives, release reports, allow full exploration? The gaps invite interpretation. They suggest that Gunkanjima's abandonment was not just the end of an industry, but the closing of a file that someone did not want reopened. And as time passed, the forbidden nature of the island became part of its power. decay advanced, buildings collapsed. Evidence disappeared naturally, swallowed by weather and corrosion. With each passing year, it became easier to claim that answers were simply lost to time. But loss and erasure are not the same thing. What remains is an island that resists clarity, a place where silence feels enforced rather than accidental, and where every blocked corridor and sealed doorway raises the same question: what exactly was left behind, and who decided it should stay there? What may be most unsettling about Gunkanjima is not what was left behind, but what was never said afterward. As years passed and the island transformed into a symbol of ruin, a subject of documentaries and photographs, one pattern became impossible to ignore. Many of those who lived there avoided speaking about it, not publicly, not on record, and often not even within their own families. The silence was not total, but it was selective, cautious, and deeply revealing. Former residents who did agree to speak tended to focus on surface memories, childhood games on rooftops, school routines, community festivals. These stories felt safe, nostalgic, almost rehearsed. But when conversations drifted toward the final years, toward the mines, the evacuation, or conditions underground, voices softened, sentences broke off. Some interviews ended abruptly. Others were followed by requests not to publish certain details. The shift was subtle but consistent. This reluctance has been explained in many ways: shame, trauma, cultural norms that discourage public complaint, fear of reopening painful chapters. All of these may play a role, but they do not fully explain the uniformity of the restraint. Gunkanjima was home to thousands. Their experiences could not have been identical, and yet the boundaries of what could be discussed appeared remarkably similar, as if an invisible line had been drawn long ago and never crossed. Some survivors hinted at informal warnings, advice from supervisors to keep quiet, suggestions that speaking openly could affect future employment, reminders that certain topics were not helpful. In a society where reputation, harmony, and collective responsibility carry immense weight, these pressures did not need to be explicit to be effective. Silence became the easiest option. There are also contradictions in the accounts that do exist. Timelines differ. Descriptions of conditions vary widely. Some recall increasing danger. Others insist everything was normal until the very end. These inconsistencies are often dismissed as memory distortion, but they may point to something else. Fragmented knowledge, if information was compartmentalized, if only certain people knew the full scope of the risk, then no single narrative would ever emerge. What survivors agree on is a shared emotional residue, a sense of unease that lingers long after leaving the island. Some describe difficulty revisiting coastal areas. Others avoided news about industrial accidents. A few admitted they never returned to Hashima, even when tours reopened, saying they preferred to remember it as it was, rather than confront what it became. Avoidance, in this context, feels less like nostalgia and more like generational silence deepened the mystery. Children who grew up on the island often learned about its darker aspects only indirectly through rumors, or fragmented conversations overheard as adults. Parents shielded them, or perhaps themselves, by not revisiting those final days. Over time, the gaps grew wider. What was not said became as significant as what was. This silence has consequences. It leaves historians with incomplete records. It allows corporations and institutions to frame the narrative with minimal resistance, and it turns Gunkanjima into a place defined as much by absence as by presence. A city remembered in fragments, shaped by what people choose not to recall. The island does not speak, and those who could have filled the silence often chose not to, whether out of fear, loyalty, exhaustion, or unresolved trauma. Their restraint has become one of Gunkanjima's most enduring mysteries. It suggests that whatever truly ended life on the island may have been more disturbing than the ruins themselves. Today, Gunkanjima stands suspended between documentation and speculation, a place where facts exist, but certainty does not. From the moment the island was abandoned, theories began to form, each attempting to explain what official records never fully clarified. Some are grounded in economics. Others point to engineering failures. A few drift into darker territory, shaped by gaps that refuse to close. The most widely accepted explanation is economic collapse. Coal demand fell. Oil became cheaper. The mines were no longer profitable. On paper, this makes sense, yet it does not explain the urgency. Industries decline all the time, and cities usually empty slowly. Gunkanjima did not fade. It shut down almost overnight. The speed suggests not just a loss of value, but a loss of safety. Another theory centers on structural failure. Decades of mining beneath the seabed may have weakened the island beyond repair. Engineers knew that subsidence was possible, even likely. If calculations showed an imminent risk of collapse or catastrophic flooding, evacuation would have been the only option. But if these were the casi, why were those reports never released? Why seal the mines instead of documenting their condition for future study? Some researchers believe the answer lies in a combination of both. As profits shrank, tolerance for risk vanished. What might have been acceptable when coal was essential became unacceptable when margins tightened. A single serious incident, unpublicized but severe enough, could have tipped the balance. A structural failure narrowly contained. An accident too costly to explain. In this scenario, silence becomes a strategy, not an accident. There are also political considerations. Gunkanjima's history is entangled with forced labor and wartime exploitation. Opening archives might expose details that complicate national narratives or corporate legacies. Letting the island decay quietly avoids confrontation. Time erodes evidence more effectively than any policy. Visitors today often describe a strange sensation while walking its paths. Not fear, but confusion. Rooms feel abandoned in haste, yet undisturbed. Corridors end abruptly. Signs warn of dangers no one explains. The island does not tell a coherent story. It offers fragments and lets the mind fill the gaps. That ambiguity is part of its power. Some believe Gunkanjima is a mirror. What we see in it depends on what we bring. For some, it is a monument to industrial ambition. For others, a graveyard of exploited labor. For many, it is a reminder that progress often leaves ruins in its wake, and that those ruins are easier to photograph than to understand. Theories will continue to multiply because the island resists closure. No final report settles the matter. No definitive account ends the debate. Gunkanjima remains intact enough to provoke questions, but broken enough to deny answers. It is a city frozen in time, not because it was preserved intentionally, but because no one ever finished telling its story. And until that story is complete, the Islang wall remains suspended between what is known and what is suspected, quietly challenging anyone who tries to reduce it to a single explanation. In the end, Gunkanjima is not just a story about an island. It is a reflection of how societies treat places once they stop being useful. The concrete ruins rising from the sea are not frozen by accident. They are frozen because forgetting was easier than explaining. When the island produced energy, it was celebrated. When it became inconvenient, it was erased from daily life and slowly transformed into an object of curiosity rather than responsibility. What Gunkanjima exposes is a familiar pattern. Progress moves fast, but memory does not always follow. Industries rise on human labor, often hidden, often undervalued. When the resource is exhausted or replaced, the structures that supported it are left behind, stripped of context. Over time, danger becomes aesthetic. Suffering becomes abstract. Ruins become tourist attractions, and the people who lived there fade into footnotes. The island also reveals how silence operates, not as emptiness, but as control. Decisions were made quietly. Information was contained. Narratives were shaped after the fact. By the time the public noticed, the chance to ask meaningful questions had already passed. What remained was concrete, rust, and speculation, enough to provoke curiosity, but not enough to assign responsibility. There is something deeply unsettling about how intact Gunkanjima still is. Many abandoned places decay into chaos. This one remains structured, almost orderly, as if it were paused deliberately. That order invites interpretation. It suggests that the end was managed, calculated, and accepted by those in power long before it was explained to those affected. The city did not collapse into ruins. It was switched off. Looking at Gunkanjima forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How many other places like this exist, stripped of attention once their purpose ended? How many stories are still sealed behind corporate archives, legal language, or social pressure? And how often do we accept simplified explanations because digging deeper would demand accountability? The island's isolation amplifies its message. Surrounded by water, cut off from the mainland, Gunkanjima cannot be ignored, but it also cannot easily be. It exists in a permanent state of in-between, neither alive nor fully dead. A warning preserved in concrete, not about the past alone, but about how easily human lives become expendable when measured against efficiency and profit. Perhaps that is why Gunkanjima continues to disturb. It does not offer closure. It does not allow a single narrative. It remains open, unresolved, and resistant to comfort. And in that resistance, it reflects something unsettling about us. Our willingness to admire the ruins of progress without asking who paid the price for them. The island waits, unchanged, as generations project their own meanings onto it. And as long as its deepest questions remain unanswered, Gunkanjima will continue to exist not just as a ghost town, but as a reminder that abandonment is rarely as simple as it appears. If you stayed until the end of this story, you already understand that Gunkanjima is more than an abandoned island. It is a question that still hasn't been answered. Now, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below with your own theory about what really forced this city to disappear so suddenly. Was it economic collapse, structural failure, hidden accidents, or something that was never meant to be revealed? Write your answer in the comments, and let's continue this discussion together. If this investigation made you see abandoned cities in a new way, don't forget to leave a like. That simple action helps this channel reach more people who are curious about forgotten places and the dark stories behind them. And if you want to keep exploring mysteries like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next investigation. On the screen right now, there's another story waiting for you. Another place abandoned, another mystery left unresolved. Click on it and continue this journey into the shadows of history.